In the highest echelons of power, the most dangerous people in the room are rarely the ones holding the guns. They are the ones holding the silence. Dominic Salvatore, the undisputed architect of the East Coast's most sophisticated illicit empire, was 90 minutes away from losing $400 million and, inevitably, his life. His accountants were sweating, his enforcers were pacing, and his rivals were already celebrating his impending assassination. He was a king backed into a corner by a silent digital execution, but survival didn't come from his Harvard-educated lawyers or his ruthless underbosses. It came from the girl pouring his Macallan, a tired, invisible waitress named Sylvia, who saw what a room full of terrifying men could not. Dominic Salvatore didn't bleed blood, he bled capital. At 34, Dominic was the heir to the Salvatore Syndicate, a sprawling organization that had evolved from the gritty, blood-soaked streets of 1980s Brooklyn into a pristine, corporate conglomerate. The Salvatores no longer broke legs for protection money. They bought senators, manipulated high-end real estate markets, and laundered hundreds of millions of dollars through global logistics companies. Dominic wore bespoke suits from Savile Row, commanded boardrooms in Manhattan, and possessed a ruthless, calculating intelligence that had kept him out of federal prison and far above his rivals. But tonight, the pristine facade was cracking. The air inside the private VIP dining room of Laura, an exclusive, Michelin-starred restaurant in Tribeca, was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and sheer, unadulterated panic. Dominic stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the relentless October rain blurring the neon lights of the city below. His dark eyes were fixed on the glass, but he wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at his own reflection, calculating the exact moment his reign would end. The crisis was a masterpiece of financial sabotage. Dominic had orchestrated a massive, legitimate acquisition of commercial ports in Miami, a $450 million deal that would finally scrub the last of his family's dirty money clean. The funds were supposed to move through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, from a holding company in Cyprus, through a trust in Belize, and finally into a corporate escrow account in Miami. But somewhere in the digital ether, the money had stalled. "Explain it to me again, Arthur," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was far more terrifying than a shout. Arthur Sterling, Dominic's chief financial officer, wiped a bead of sweat from his receding hairline. His hands hovered over the keyboard of a high-powered encrypted laptop sitting on the mahogany dining table. "It's a localized freeze, Mr. Salvatore. The transfer initiated from the Belize Trust, but it hasn't hit the clearinghouse in London. The system is showing a routing anomaly. The funds are sitting in a temporary holding ledger. If they don't land in the Miami escrow by midnight, the Colombian cartel holding the collateral will consider it a breach of contract." "And if they consider it a breach?" asked Silas, Dominic's head of security, a mountain of a man who looked distinctly out of place in a tailored tuxedo. "They take the collateral," Dominic answered without turning around, "which means they take the docks, they take our East Coast supply lines, and they put a bullet in my head by breakfast." "Who did this, Arthur?" "Money doesn't just get tired and stop moving." Arthur swallowed hard. "It looks like a banking error, sir. A glitch in the SWIFT protocol." "I don't believe in glitches," Dominic said, finally turning to face the room. His gaze flicked to Leo Castiglione, his oldest friend and underboss, who sat quietly at the table, sipping his scotch. Leo looked concerned, perfectly playing the part of the loyal soldier. But Dominic's instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive this long, screamed that there was a traitor in the room. Outside the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, the world was completely unaware of the empire collapsing within. Sylvia Hayes wiped down a marble prep counter in the waiter's station, suppressing a yawn. She was 26, with exhausted blue eyes and hair tied back in a severe, practical bun. To the patrons of Laura, Sylvia was a phantom. She was part of the ambiance, a mechanism to deliver plates of truffle risotto and pour $1,000 bottles of wine without ever making a sound or interrupting a conversation. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was safe. 4 years ago, Sylvia had been the top of her class in a forensic accounting master's program at NYU. She had a brilliant mind for numbers, an uncanny ability to spot anomalies in massive datasets, and a promising career lined up at a Big Four accounting firm. Then, reality hit. Her father, a proud but naive small business owner, was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer, To keep his failing construction business afloat and pay for experimental treatments, he had borrowed money from the wrong people connected to the very syndicates Sylvia was now serving. When her father passed away, he left behind a mountain of medical debt and a terrifying ledger of underworld loans. Sylvia had dropped out of school, surrendered her dreams, and taken 3 jobs just to keep the loan sharks from breaking her brother's legs. She worked at Laura because the tips from the criminal elite were astronomical. She served the men who owned her father's debt. It was a bitter, exhausting irony. Sylvia, whispered the Mayette tree, a sharp-featured man named Henri. Table 7. The private room. They need their glasses refreshed. And bring the 1,996 Dom Perignon. The atmosphere in there is tense. Get in, pour, and get out. Do not make eye contact. Understood, Sylvia said, her voice flat. She picked up the silver tray, balancing the heavy bottle and fresh crystal flutes. She approached the heavy oak doors of the VIP room, took a deep breath, and knocked twice before pushing the door open. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. 4 pairs of eyes snapped to her, hard and assessing. Sylvia kept her gaze lowered, her face a mask of professional deference. She walked toward the mahogany table, the tension in the room so thick it felt like physical pressure against her chest. She moved to Arthur first, expertly replacing his empty tumbler. As she leaned in to pour the champagne, her eyes naturally fell onto the glowing screen of the laptop. She didn't mean to look. She certainly didn't mean to analyze it, but Sylvia's brain was wired for data. She saw a cascading spreadsheet of international routing numbers, SWIFT codes, and timestamped transactions. To a layman, it was a blur of alphanumeric soup, but to Sylvia, it was a language she used to speak fluently. She poured the champagne for Silas, then moved to Leo, and finally to Dominic. Dominic watched her, his expression unreadable. He was strikingly handsome, but there was a cold, predatory stillness about him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice surprisingly soft. "You're welcome, sir," Sylvia replied automatically. She turned to leave, her heart beating a steady, practiced rhythm. But as she took a step toward the door, her mind processed what she had just seen on Arthur's screen. The numbers clicked into place. The pattern formed. Wait, she thought, her steps faltering for a fraction of a second. That isn't a banking error. She had written a thesis on corporate embezzlement structures. She recognized the specific sequence of the routing codes on the screen. It was a round-robin loop, a highly illegal, incredibly sophisticated piece of malware designed to intercept wire transfers, bounce them between ghost servers to stall the clock, and then permanently reroute them to an untraceable shadow account once a specific time elapsed. She knew what that screen meant. Whoever owned that laptop was actively stealing millions of dollars right in front of the boss's eyes. Sylvia slipped out of the private dining room, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind her. She leaned against the cool wall of the service hallway, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands were shaking. She tightly gripped the silver serving tray to steady them. "Forget it," she told herself fiercely. "It's none of your business. You serve drinks. You smile. You pay your brother's tuition, and you pay down the debt. You do not get involved in whatever multi-million-dollar bloodbath is happening in Table 7. But her mind wouldn't shut off. The numbers burned behind her eyelids. The money hadn't stalled in a London clearinghouse, as the nervous accountant had claimed. The SWIFT codes she had glimpsed ended in a specific suffix, a tag used by offshore banks in the Cayman Islands that catered specifically to numbered, anonymous accounts. And the timing mechanism she saw in the transaction log. She glanced at the grandfather clock at the end of the hall. It was 10:45 p.m. The funds weren't stuck. They were in a holding pattern. And based on the automated trigger sequence she had spotted on the ledger, at exactly 11:59 p.m., those funds were going to drop into a black hole, never to be seen again. Inside the room, the volume of the argument was rising, bleeding through the thick wood of the door. "We are running out of time, Dom," Leo Castiglione's voice drifted through, calm and persuasive. "If the Colombians don't see the wire confirmation by midnight, they won't just take the ports. They'll send sicarios to your mother's house in Connecticut. We have to pivot." "Pivot to what, Leo?" Dominic's voice snapped like a whip, laced with a dangerous edge. "We have an emergency reserve," Leo replied smoothly. "The syndicate's pension fund, the clean assets we hold in the Swiss trusts. It's exactly 450 million. We initiate a manual override. wire that money directly to the Miami escrow to satisfy the Colombians, and we figure out where the original money got stuck tomorrow. You want me to drain the syndicate's entire safety net? Dominic asked, his tone deadly quiet. If I do that, we have zero liquidity. We're exposed. It's better than being dead, Dom. Let Arthur prep the Swiss wire. It's the only way. Out in the hallway, Sylvia pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes widened in horror. It was a trap. A brilliant, devastating trap. The man named Leo wasn't trying to save his boss. He was trying to ruin him. Sylvia could see the architecture of the scam with terrifying clarity. The first 450 million was already gone, hijacked by the malware on the accountant's computer. The moment the clock struck midnight, that money would be in Leo's pocket. But Leo was greedy. He had engineered the fake delay to panic Dominic into authorizing a second transfer, draining the syndicate's reserves. If Dominic authorized the Swiss wire, the malware on that infected laptop would instantly hijack that second transfer as well. Dominic wouldn't just lose the original 450 million, he would lose 900 million. He would be left completely bankrupt, defenseless, and dead by morning. Sylvia felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. Why do I care? She thought desperately. He's a criminal, a mob boss, let them eat each other. But she remembered the look in Dominic Salvatore's eyes. It wasn't just fear or anger. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of responsibility. He was a man holding up the sky, completely unaware that his closest friend was currently sawing through the pillars. More importantly, Sylvia knew how men like Dominic operated. When the money vanished, he wouldn't just blame his accountant. He would tear the city apart looking for the leak. He would question everyone who had been in that room. He would question the staff. He would question the waitress who had been standing over the laptop. People in her position had been killed for seeing far less. If she stayed silent, she was collateral damage in a mob war. If she spoke up, she might be shot right there in the dining room. Eliki PM. Henri, the maitre d', hurried down the hall. Sylvia, what are you doing standing around? Table 4 needs their crepes flambéed. Henri, Sylvia said, her voice trembling slightly. I have to go back into the private room. Absolutely not, Henri hissed, his face pale. You only go in when called. You know the rules. The men in that room, you do not interrupt them. Ever. They are going to make a mistake, Sylvia whispered, her eyes locked on the heavy oak doors. A fatal one. Before Henri could grab her arm, Sylvia turned and walked back toward table 7. She didn't bother knocking this time. She pushed the heavy oak doors open. The scene inside was frozen in high tension. Arthur's trembling fingers were hovering over the laptop keyboard. Leo was standing over him, a reassuring hand on the accountant's shoulder. Silas had his hand inside his jacket, resting on his holstered weapon, and Dominic was standing at the head of the table, his jaw clenched, staring at the screen. Do it, Arthur, Dominic commanded, his voice heavy with defeat. Authorize the Swiss wire. Save the deal. Stop. The word tore out of Sylvia's throat before she could stop it. It was loud, echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Silas moved with a speed that belied his massive size. Within a fraction of a second, a heavy, suppressed pistol was drawn and pointed directly at the center of Sylvia's forehead. Not another step, sweetheart, Silas growled, his finger whitening on the trigger. Arthur gasped and fell back in his chair. Leo's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing into venomous slits. Dominic didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head to look at Sylvia. His dark eyes were absolute zero. The silence in the room was so profound that Sylvia could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. Give me one good reason, Dominic said, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper. Why I shouldn't let Silas paint the wall with you for interrupting this meeting. Sylvia's knees threatened to buckle. The black hollow of the gun barrel looked impossibly large. She forced herself to look away from the weapon and lock eyes with Dominic Salvatore. She channeled every ounce of the brilliant, confident woman she used to be before the debt crushed her. Because, Sylvia said, her voice shaking only slightly, if you let him press enter on that keyboard, you won't just lose the port. You will lose everything. The money isn't stuck, Mr. Salvatore. It's being stolen. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. Get this crazy bitch out of here, Leo spat, dropping his calm facade. Silas, drag her out. Arthur, Initiate the transfer now. I said stop, Dominic commanded. The sheer authority in his voice froze both Silas and Arthur in their tracks. Dominic kept his eyes locked on Sylvia. He stepped slowly around the table, entering her personal space. He smelled of rain, bergamot, and violence. You're the waitress, Dominic stated, looking down at her name tag. Sylvia. Yes, she managed to say, holding her ground. You pour drinks, you clear plates, and yet you walk into a closed room, stare down a loaded gun, and tell me my money is being stolen. Dominic tilted his head. Who sent you? The Colombians? The Rossi family? Nobody sent me, Sylvia said, her voice growing stronger as the adrenaline burned through her fear. I'm just a waitress. But before I was a waitress, I was 2 semesters away from my master's in forensic accounting. I specialize in international corporate fraud. Leo let out a harsh, barking laugh. Are you out of your mind, Dom? You're listening to the help? We have exactly 50 minutes to clear this wire. Dominic ignored him. He didn't take his eyes off Sylvia. Explain. Quickly. You have 30 seconds before Silas pulls the trigger. Sylvia swallowed dryly. She pointed a trembling finger past Dominic toward Arthur's laptop. Your accountant told you the funds are stuck in a localized freeze in London because of a swift routing error. But I saw the screen when I poured the champagne. The receiving codes aren't kicking back error messages. They are actively mirroring the transaction. Arthur's face drained of all color. She doesn't know what she's talking about. It's encrypted data. It's an algorithmic loop, Sylvia shot back, looking directly at Arthur. You initiated the transfer to the Belize Trust, but the IP address on your Manacro is masked. I saw the string of numbers on the secondary ledger behind your active window. It ends in 004 Cayman. That's not a clearinghouse. That's a blind trust in the Cayman Islands, a numbered account. Dominic turned his head slightly toward Arthur. Is she lying? Arthur? Dom, she's a waitress trying to play spy, Leo interjected, stepping forward, his hands slipping into his own jacket. Arthur has been with us for 10 years. You're going to trust some girl who serves risotto over your own CFO? I am listening to the girl, Leo, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a sudden, chilling danger. Because Arthur looks like he's about to vomit. Arthur was, indeed, hyperventilating. His hands were shaking so violently they rattled against the desk. If he hits execute on the Swiss wire, Sylvia continued, the words spilling out rapidly, the malware on that laptop will piggyback the new transfer. It won't go to Miami. The system is programmed to hold both transfers until 11:59 p.m. At midnight, both the original $450 million and the new $450 million will bypass the Belize Trust and dump directly into the Cayman account. You'll be bled dry. Dominic looked at the screen, then at Arthur. Arthur, step away from the computer. Dom, please, Arthur stammered, tears suddenly springing to his eyes. I didn't want to. I swear to God, I didn't want to do it. The admission hung in the air like a detonated bomb. Silas immediately shifted his aim from Sylvia to Arthur. Who? Dominic asked, his voice dead calm. Arthur looked terrified, his eyes darting frantically toward Leo. It was a micro-expression, a fraction of a second. But in the underworld, a glance was a confession. Leo didn't hesitate. Realizing the game was up, Leo drew his weapon with lightning speed, aiming directly for Dominic's chest. Dom, look out! Sylvia screamed, dropping to the floor. The room exploded into chaos. Silas fired first, but Leo had anticipated it, diving behind a heavy leather armchair. Silas's bullet shattered the mahogany paneling where Leo's head had been a millisecond before. Leo returned fire, the deafening cracks of the gunshots ringing out in the confined space. A bullet shattered the champagne bottle Sylvia had left on the table, sending shards of crystal and vintage wine exploding across the room. Dominic didn't dive for cover. He moved with terrifying precision. As Leo popped up from behind the chair to fire again, Dominic had already drawn a compact Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster. He fired twice. Leo gasped, dropping his gun. He clutched his shoulder, falling back against the wall, sliding down to the floor, leaving a trail of crimson on the expensive wallpaper. Silence slammed back into the room, broken only by Arthur's pathetic sobbing and the ringing in Sylvia's ears. Dominic stood perfectly still, his gun still raised, the smoke curling from the barrel. He looked at Leo, bleeding out on the floor, his oldest friend and most trusted lieutenant. You got greedy, Leo, Dominic said, his voice devoid of emotion. You're weak, Dom, Leo spat, coughing blood. Trying to go legit. The families. They smell blood. If I didn't take the Empire, someone else would have. Dominic turned to Silas. Clean him up. And secure Arthur. If Arthur moves a muscle, break his legs. Yes, boss, Silas said grimly, moving toward the whimpering accountant. Dominic slowly holstered his weapon. He turned and looked down at Sylvia, who was still huddled on the floor, her hands over her ears, shaking violently. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, crushing wave of terror. She had just witnessed a mob shootout. She was a dead woman. Dominic stepped toward her. He reached out a hand. Sylvia flinched away, squeezing her eyes shut. Open your eyes, Dominic said softly. She slowly opened them. Dominic's hand was still extended. There was no menace in his face now, only a profound, intense curiosity. You just saved my life, Dominic said, his tone carrying a weight that made Sylvia's breath hitch. And you just saved my empire. He took her trembling hand and gently pulled her to her feet. He looked at her not as a waitress, not as a piece of the scenery, but as an equal. Arthur is compromised, Dominic said, looking back at the laptop. The clock in the corner of the screen read 11:05 p.m. The malware is still active. The original 450 million is still trapped in that digital loop, counting down to midnight. I have 55 minutes to untangle the knot Leo built, bypass the Cayman account, and force the money to Miami, or I'm still a dead man. Dominic looked back at Sylvia, his dark eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. You said you understand this architecture, Dominic said. Can you stop it? Can you reroute the money? Sylvia stared at the screen. She thought of her father, her debt, her brother's future. She thought of the safe, invisible life she had built, and how she had just burned it to the ground in a span of 5 minutes. If I do this, Sylvia said, her voice finding its strength, I'm not a waitress anymore. I'm an accomplice to the Salvatore family. I cross a line I can never uncross. Sylvia, Dominic stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You crossed that line the moment you opened your mouth to save a monster. You're already in. Now, the only question is whether you want to be rich and alive or dead and invisible. He stepped aside, gesturing to the chair Arthur had just vacated. 54 minutes, Dominic said. Save us both. Sylvia took a deep breath, walked past the bleeding underboss, the weeping accountant, and the massive enforcer. She sat down in the leather chair, pulled the laptop toward her, and began to type. The keyboard of Arthur's encrypted laptop was slick with the CFO's sweat, but Sylvia's fingers flew across the keys with a desperate, practiced grace. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder now, each hollow chime a hammer blow against her nerves. It was 11:12 p.m., 47 minutes until Dominic Salvatore's empire collapsed and the Colombian cartel issued a death warrant. Silas, Dominic's voice was a low, commanding rumble behind her. Get Arthur and Leo out of my sight. Take them down to the soundproofed wine cellar. Keep Arthur breathing. I still need his biometrics and passcodes. Leo, just keep him breathing long enough for me to ask him a few questions later. Sylvia flinched as she heard the heavy thud of Silas dragging Leo's bleeding body across the thick Persian rug. She forced her eyes to remain glued to the screen. The acrid smell of cordite from the discharged weapons hung heavy in the air, mixing nauseatingly with the spilled vintage champagne. She was no longer in a high-end restaurant. She was in a war room. Talk to me, Sylvia, Dominic said, stepping up right behind her chair. His presence was a solid, radiating heat at her back. He wasn't crowding her, but he was close enough that she could feel the tension vibrating off him. Arthur was sloppy, but whoever wrote this malware is a ghost, Sylvia muttered, her eyes darting across cascading lines of transaction logs. It's a modified logic bomb, deeply embedded in the SWIFT protocol gateway. They didn't just reroute the money, they mirrored the IP address of the Belize Trust. Every time the clearinghouse queries the funds, the malware sends an automated ping saying, "Hold, compliance check pending. It's buying time." Where is the destination account? Dominic asked, his tone clipped. A numbered account at a private offshore bank in Georgetown, Cayman Islands, Cayman National Corporation, most likely, based on the routing prefix, she replied, bringing up a command terminal. If I try to cancel the transfer outright, the logic bomb will trigger early, interpreting it as a threat. The $450 million will instantly dump into the Cayman account. So we can't stop it, Dominic stated, the cold reality settling in. I didn't say that, Sylvia shot back, a sudden, fierce spark of her old, brilliant self igniting. I said we can't cancel it, but I can trick it. Ombir, Yermisik is PM. Sylvia bypassed the standard banking interface entirely, diving into the raw API of the syndicate's financial network. She was sweating now, stray strands of her severe bun falling across her face. The malware is programmed to release the funds to the Cayman account at precisely 11:59 p.m., Sylvia explained, her fingers blurring over the keys. It's a blind execution. It doesn't verify the destination account at the final millisecond. It just releases the dam. I need to build a ghost node. Speak English, Dominic ordered softly. I'm going to create a fake digital routing node that mimics the Cayman Island Bank's signature, she said, her voice tight with concentration. I'll splice it directly into the communication pathway. When the malware triggers at 11:59, it will drop the $450 million into what it thinks is Leo's offshore account. But the second the money hits my ghost node, I will instantly bounce it through a high-frequency trading server I used to use at NYU and slam it directly into the Miami escrow account. Dominic fell silent. He watched the screen, watching lines of code and routing numbers construct a digital bridge over a $450 million abyss. He had employed Harvard graduates, former Wall Street wolves, and highly paid European hackers. None of them possessed the sheer, raw, improvisational brilliance of the waitress sitting in front of him. Amber, Kirkbesh PM. I need Arthur's physical RSA token to authorize the final leap from the ghost node to Miami, Sylvia said urgently, her eyes wide. The two-factor authentication. Dominic didn't hesitate. He strode to the door, opened it, and spoke a single word to Silas in the hallway. Less than 30 seconds later, Dominic returned, dropping a small, black RSA key fob onto the desk next to Sylvia. It had a smear of blood on it. Sylvia felt her stomach heave, but she swallowed the bile. She typed the 6-digit code flashing on the fob into her terminal. Ombid alt PM. The bridge is built, Sylvia whispered, her hands shaking so badly she had to pull them away from the keyboard and press them flat against her thighs. Now, we wait. If my spoofed signature is off by even a single byte, the malware will bypass my node and the money goes to Leo's ghost account. Dominic pulled up a chair next to her. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the grandfather clock. 56 PM. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Sylvia felt as though her heart was trying to batter its way out of her ribcage. She had never gambled before. Now, she was gambling with a mafia empire and her own life. Shi sao shi wushabafen sishu miao. Shi sao shi wushabafen wushamiao. Whatever happens, Dominic said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. You did more than the men I paid millions to protect me. Shi sao shi wushabafen wushaba miao. Shi sao shi wushabafen wushijiu miao. Shi sao shi wushijiufen. The laptop screen froze. The cascading lines of code stopped. A small loading icon spun in the center of the terminal window. For 5 excruciating seconds, the digital world held its breath. Then, the screen flashed a brilliant, blinding green. Transfer complete. Destination: Miami escrow. Amount: $450 million USD. Clearing status: verified. Sylvia let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She slumped back in the leather chair, all the strength instantly draining from her muscles. Dominic's phone immediately vibrated in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, looking at an encrypted text message. He read it, then slowly lowered the phone. The Colombians just confirmed receipt, Dominic said, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. The ports are ours. The collateral is secure. He turned his head and looked at Sylvia. The predatory coldness was entirely gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, calculating respect. You just saved my life, Sylvia. The adrenaline crash hit Sylvia like a physical blow. The reality of her situation rushed back in, tearing away the protective veil of her hyperfocus. She looked at the shattered champagne bottle, the bullet hole in the mahogany wall, the smear of Leo's blood on the rug, and finally, at the blood on the RSA token resting next to her hand. She abruptly stood up, pushing the chair back violently. I have to go. I have to get back to my shift. Henri is going to fire me. I need this job. She took 2 steps toward the door before Dominic caught her arm. His grip was firm, but not bruising. Sylvia, look at me, he commanded gently. She shook her head, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. Please, Mr. Salvatore. I didn't see anything. I don't know anything. I just want to go home to my brother. You are not going back to pouring wine, and you are certainly not walking out that door to catch the subway, Dominic said, stepping squarely into her path. You just witnessed the underboss of the Salvatore family commit high treason. You saw me shoot him. You hacked a multi-million-dollar syndicate wire transfer. You are in this now. There is no going back to being invisible. Then what are you going to do? Sylvia cried out, her voice cracking with terror. Kill me? Throw me in the river to tie up loose ends? Dominic looked genuinely offended for a brief second. He released her arm. If I wanted you dead, you would have died the moment you walked through that door. I don't destroy assets. And you, Sylvia, are the most extraordinary asset I have ever encountered. He walked over to the sidebar and poured 2 glasses of the remaining, untouched Macallan from a crystal decanter. He handed one to her. She took it automatically, her hands trembling so much the amber liquid splashed against the glass. Sit, Dominic said, pointing to a pristine armchair furthest from the bloodstain. Sylvia sat. She took a sip of the scotch. It burned a fiery path down her throat, grounding her slightly. An NYU forensic accounting prodigy, Dominic mused, taking a seat opposite her. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. You possess a skill set that Wall Street firms would pay 7 figures for. Yet, you are wearing a polyester uniform, dodging the maitre d', and working the graveyard shift at Lara. Why? Sylvia stared at the floor. The shame was almost as bad as the fear. It doesn't matter. It matters to me, Dominic said, his tone leaving no room for argument. If we are going to do business, I need to know what controls you. Debt, Sylvia whispered bitterly. My father ran a construction company in Queens. He got sick, pancreatic cancer. Insurance didn't cover the experimental trials. He borrowed money to keep the business afloat and pay the hospital bills. He didn't tell us who he borrowed it from until he was on his deathbed. Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. Who holds the paper? The Russo brothers, Sylvia said, spitting the name out like poison. $350,000, compounding weekly. When my dad died, they came for my younger brother. He's 19. They threatened to shatter his kneecaps if we missed a payment. I had to drop out of my master's program. I work 3 jobs. Every dime goes to the Russos just to cover the interest. Dominic sat back in his chair, a dark, dangerous smile slowly spreading across his face. The Russo brothers were a mid-level loan sharking operation running out of the Bronx. They paid tribute to the Salvatore syndicate. Technically, they worked for Dominic. 350,000, Dominic repeated softly. A rounding error. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, putting it on speaker and placing it on the table between them. It rang twice. Boss, a gruff voice answered instantly. Frankie, Dominic said smoothly. Call Tommy Russo. Tell him the debt belonging to the Hayes family, the father from Queens, is officially cleared. The principal is zeroed, the interest is voided. The Salvatore family is assuming the ledger. There was a brief pause. Understood, boss. Consider it done. The Russos won't go near them. If they do, burn their social club to the ground, Dominic added casually, before ending the call. Sylvia stared at the phone, completely paralyzed. The crushing, suffocating weight that had ruled every second of her life for the past 2 years had just been annihilated in a 30-second phone call. Why? Sylvia asked, her voice a fragile whisper. You don't owe me anything. I saved your money, but you saved my life, Dominic corrected her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I value my life at considerably more than 350 grand. But let's be clear. Sylvia, I am a businessman, and I do not do charity. That was not a gift. That was a signing bonus. Sylvia swallowed hard. A signing bonus for what? Arthur is no longer the chief financial officer of the Salvatore syndicate, Dominic said coldly, glancing toward the door where the weeping accountant had been dragged away. He is currently a liability breathing on borrowed time. My empire spans real estate, logistics, international shipping, and private equity. It is a $4 billion machine that requires absolute, ruthless precision. And clearly, it requires someone who can see the traps my enemies and my friends build for me. Dominic stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at her, a towering figure of wealth, power, and terrifying authority. "You are no longer a waitress, Sylvia," Dominic declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "As of tomorrow morning, you are the head of forensic auditing for the Salvatore Corporation. You will have a corner office in Manhattan, a seven-figure salary, and a security detail that reports directly to me. Your brother's tuition will be paid in full. You will never serve another drink as long as you live." Sylvia stared at him, her mind spinning wildly. He was offering her the world. He was offering her freedom from poverty, but he was also locking her in a gilded cage. If she accepted, she was officially mobbed up. She would be cleaning the blood off his ledgers. "And if I say no?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dominic's expression softened. Just a fraction, revealing a glimmer of something fiercely protective. "You know too much to walk away, Sylvia. The people Leo was working with, they will find out what you did tonight. They will come for you. If you walk out of this restaurant alone, you won't survive the week. Stay with me, and I swear on my life, no one will ever lay a hand on you or your brother again." He reached out his hand to her, just as he had done after the shootout. But this time, it wasn't just to help her off the floor, it was a contract. Sylvia looked at the blood on the rug. She thought of her brother's safety. She thought of the raw, electric thrill she had felt when she outsmarted the malware. For the first time in years, she felt powerful. Slowly, deliberately, Sylvia reached out and placed her hand in Dominic Salvatore's. His grip was warm, solid, and absolute. "All right, Mr. Salvatore," Sylvia said, locking her eyes with his. "I accept." Dominic smiled, a genuine, striking smile that changed his entire face. "Welcome to the family, Sylvia. And please, call me Dominic." 6 months later, the polyester uniform of Lara was nothing more than a phantom memory. Sylvia Hayes stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 52nd floor of the Salvatore Corporation's Manhattan headquarters. She wore a tailored, charcoal Armani suit that fit her like armor. Her hair no longer scraped into a severe bun, but falling in soft, confident waves over her shoulders. The view was identical to the one Dominic had stared out at on that rainy October night, but the city no longer looked like a threat to Sylvia. It looked like a chessboard. True to his word, Dominic had eradicated her past. Her brother, Thomas, was safely enrolled at Columbia University, his tuition paid in full by a seemingly legitimate scholarship fund, his dorm quietly watched by two of Silas's most discreet men. The Russo brothers had vanished from the Bronx without a trace, their predatory ledgers mysteriously wiping clean the debts of 36 families overnight. Sylvia was officially the head of forensic auditing, a title that sounded impeccably corporate but meant something entirely different in the underworld. She was the shield wall around Dominic's empire. Every dollar that flowed through his shipping containers, real estate ventures, and offshore accounts was scrutinized by her brilliant, unforgiving mind. She had rooted out 3 more embedded embezzlers, restructured his entire laundering apparatus into a virtually impenetrable digital fortress, and saved him an additional $60 million in leaks. She was respected, she was feared, and, to her own quiet terror, she was falling in love with the devil himself. "You're working late again," a deep, gravelly voice broke the silence of her office. Sylvia didn't jump. She had learned to anticipate the silent, predatory grace of Dominic Salvatore. She turned away from the panoramic view of the sparkling skyline. Dominic stood in the doorway, the harsh office lighting doing nothing to diminish his devastating presence. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight blue suit, his tie loosened, a rare look of exhaustion softening the hard lines of his jaw. "The numbers don't sleep, Dominic," Sylvia said, a faint smile playing on her lips as she walked back to her massive glass desk. "And neither do your enemies." Dominic stepped into the room, closing the heavy frosted glass door behind him. The lock clicked a sound that always sent a complicated thrill down Sylvia's spine. He closed the distance between them, leaning his hip against the edge of her desk, invading her personal space with an intoxicating mix of expensive cologne and sheer, raw authority. "My enemies have been remarkably quiet since you rebuilt my firewall," Dominic murmured, his dark eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "In fact, the 5 families are terrified of my new auditor. They call you La Strega, the witch." "I'll take it as a compliment," Sylvia replied. though her heart was hammering against her ribs. The chemistry between them had been building for half a year, a slow-burning, high-stakes electrical storm that neither had explicitly acknowledged, but both felt in every lingering glance and accidental brush of hands. "You should," Dominic said softly, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her jawline, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. The touch was possessive, reverent. "But you need to go home, Sylvia. Silas is waiting downstairs with the car." Sylvia leaned into his touch for a fraction of a second before her eyes drifted back to the glowing monitors on her desk. The romantic tension abruptly shattered, replaced by the icy chill of realization. "I can't go home," she whispered, her posture stiffening. "Dominic, look at this." He immediately dropped his hand, his demeanor instantly shifting from a man captivated by a woman to a mob boss evaluating a threat. He moved behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders as he stared at the screen. "What am I looking at?" he asked, his voice hardening. "I've been running a deep dive diagnostic on the dormant servers Leo used for his communication before you." "Retired him," Sylvia explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate a string of code. "Arthur was the one who physically planted the malware on that laptop 6 months ago, but I always knew he wasn't smart enough to write it. Neither was Leo. We assumed they bought it on the dark web," Dominic said, his grip tightening slightly on her shoulders. "So did I. Until tonight," Sylvia said, her voice dropping to a tense whisper. "The code wasn't dead, Dominic. It was a sleeper agent. At exactly midnight last night, a microscript buried in the architecture woke up and sent a single, encrypted ping to an external server. It was a status update. Someone has been waiting 6 months to see if the back door was still open." Dominic's jaw clenched. "Trace it." "I did," Sylvia said, bringing up a map. A red beacon pulsed over a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. "The IP address bounces through a dozen VPNs, but the physical server is located at a private residence registered to a holding company called Apex Solutions. It's a front." "For who?" "Carmine Moretti," Sylvia stated, naming the most ruthless patriarch of the East Coast syndicates, a man who had publicly toasted Dominic's health at a sit-down just last week. Moretti wrote the code. "Leo and Arthur were just his Trojan horses. He didn't just want to steal your $450 million, Dominic. He wanted to bankrupt you so his family could absorb the Salvatore territories without firing a shot." The silence in the office was deafening. Dominic stared at the screen, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fury. If Moretti was the architect, the war wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. "Moretti is hosting a charity gala at that Hamptons estate tomorrow night," Dominic said, his voice a lethal, vibrating hum. "Half the political establishment of New York will be there. He thinks he's untouchable. He holds the master key to that malware," Sylvia warned, turning her chair to face him. "If he realizes the back door is closed, he might trigger a burn protocol. He could wipe our entire logistical database out of spite." Dominic looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Then we don't let him realize it. We go to the gala. We smile. We drink his champagne. And while I keep the old man occupied, you get into his private office, access that physical server, and tear his digital empire down to the studs." Sylvia's breath hitched. "You want me to go into the field?" "Dominic, I'm an auditor, not a spy." Dominic leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You are the smartest person in any room you walk into, Sylvia. You survived, Leo. You survived, Silas, pointing a gun at your head. You can survive a room full of arrogant men in tuxedos. But I won't order you. If you want to stay here, behind the glass, I will send Silas." Sylvia looked into his dark, magnetic eyes. She saw the absolute trust he placed in her. He wasn't just asking her to do a job. He was asking her to stand by his side as an equal in a war. She stood up, closing the distance between them until their chests were almost touching. "Silas doesn't know the difference between a logic bomb and a firewall," Sylvia said, her voice steady and fiercely resolute. "I'll need a new dress." The Moretti estate in the Hamptons was a sprawling Gilded Age monstrosity, tonight crawling with armed men in tuxedos masquerading as philanthropists. Sylvia glided through the crowded ballroom, looking less like an auditor and more like a weapon forged from emerald silk. Her backless gown drew the eyes of every power broker in the room, but her focus was singular. Across the floor, Dominic held court, looking like a dark king. He caught her eye over the rim of his crystal glass and gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Go." Sylvia slipped away, bypassing the mahogany doors to the private wing using a cloned RFID keycard. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm, but her mind was cold and laser-focused. She reached the third floor and slipped into Carmine Moretti's private study. It smelled of old leather and arrogance. In the corner sat the prize, a matte black, custom-built server rack blinking quietly in the shadows. Dropping to her knees, Sylvia pulled a sleek, decrypted flash drive from her clutch and plugged it into the master terminal. She didn't just want to delete Moretti's sleeper code. She wanted a hostage. Her fingers flew across the backlit keyboard, infiltrating his primary financial network. She didn't steal his money, she encrypted it. She built a digital deadman switch around his entire fortune, tying the decryption key directly to the biometric heartbeat monitor on her smartwatch. 11:42 p.m. The download finished. She had him. I have to admit, a raspy, cruel voice echoed from the doorway. I expected Salvatore to send a hitman. I didn't expect him to send a supermodel. Sylvia froze, then slowly turned. Carmine Moretti stood in the doorway, a suppressed, silver-plated pistol aimed at her chest. Behind him stood two massive enforcers. And right beside Moretti was Dominic, his hands raised in mock surrender, a furious, lethal calm radiating from him. "Step away from the terminal, little girl," Moretti sneered. Dominic thought he could distract me downstairs, but I get alerts when a rat enters my study. Dominic looked at Sylvia, his eyes entirely devoid of fear. "Is it done, Sylvia?" "It's done," she replied smoothly, standing up and brushing the dust from her gown. She didn't raise her hands. Instead, she simply tapped the face of her smartwatch. Moretti let out a grating laugh. "What's done? You deleted my surveillance code? Cute. But now you're trespassing, which gives me the right to put a bullet in your head." "I didn't delete your code, Carmine," Sylvia said, her voice ringing with boardroom authority. She took a step forward, ignoring the gun. "I quarantined it, and while I was inside your system, I installed a ransomware package on your offshore holdings. Cyprus, Geneva, the Caymans, all of it." Moretti's smile faltered. "You're bluffing." "Check your phone," Sylvia countered, her eyes flashing with a brilliant fire. Moretti gestured to one of his guards, who hurriedly opened a banking application on a secured tablet. The guard's face drained of color. "Boss, the accounts. They're locked. All of them. There's a countdown timer." "If my heart stops beating," Sylvia said, tapping her watch again. "Or if I don't enter a randomly generated alphanumeric passcode by sunrise, your entire financial data is permanently wiped, and a mirrored copy of your ledger goes straight to the FBI." The silence in the study was absolute. Moretti lowered the gun, his face purple with rage. He looked from Sylvia to Dominic, realizing with crushing certainty that he had been entirely outmaneuvered. "You don't hold a gun to the head of the Salvatore family," Carmine had said, dropping his hands, his voice a lethal promise. "Sign over the Miami shipping lanes to me by tomorrow morning, and never cross the Brooklyn Bridge again. If you do, my head of auditing will bankrupt you before you finish your morning espresso." Dominic walked past the paralyzed enforcers. He reached Sylvia, wrapping a possessive arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Let's go home, Strega," he murmured. They walked out of the study, leaving the ruined patriarch staring blankly at the blinking cursor on his infected server. 10 minutes later, they were in the soundproofed back of Dominic's armored Maybach, speeding away from the Hamptons. The adrenaline finally began to crash. Sylvia let out a long, shuddering breath, resting her head against the cool leather seat. Dominic reached across the console, his large, warm hand interlacing with hers. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He shifted closer, pulling her into his chest. "I have never been terrified in my entire life, Sylvia. Not until I saw his gun pointed at you." Sylvia tilted her head up, looking into his eyes. The barrier between boss and employee completely vanished, leaving only the raw truth of what they had become. "I told you," Sylvia whispered. "I protect your empire." "To hell with the empire," Dominic said fiercely, his hand tangling in her hair. "You protect me, and I vow to you, Sylvia, with everything I am, I will protect you." He didn't wait for a response. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was desperate, consuming, and powerful. It was a promise signed in fire, sealing her fate not just as the architect of his fortune, but as the absolute queen of his world. Sylvia kissed him back with all the fierce passion she had kept hidden, finally stepping out of the shadows and fully into the light of her dangerous new life. In the end, power is not measured by the caliber of a weapon or the sheer volume of a bank account, but by the loyalty of the people who stand beside you when the walls begin to fall. Dominic Salvatore was a man who ruled through fear, isolation, and calculated violence, destined to be betrayed by the very world he conquered. Yet, his salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. A quiet waitress drowning in debt, armed only with a brilliant mind and the courage to speak when silence meant death. Sylvia Hayes did not just save millions of dollars. She rewired the very foundation of a criminal empire, transforming herself from a forgotten victim of circumstance into an irreplaceable queen. Together, they proved that the most unbreakable armor in a world of treachery is an alliance forged in fire, absolute trust, and a love that refuses to surrender.